We're back. Tasty Crypto Show. Ryan Grace, Frank Caberna. May 22nd. Party time.
Party time.
Bitcoin pizza party time, Frank.
You sent me this.
Yeah.
I spoke it out loud to all the people around me, and everybody laughed.
I think it's what, $700 million? 10,000 Bitcoin?
Well, yeah. Why don't you set the scene? This is, I think, a good way to.
Oh, I thought
start the
everybody
show.
knew what we're talking about. It's Bitcoin Pizza Day, obviously.
Bitcoin Pizza Day. It's
Yeah.
a lot like, who's the guy? You're from New York. Who's the guy? The Mets player or whatever.
Oh, I'm from the western side of the state.
Oh,
Sorry.
never mind.
Yes, Bitcoin Pizza Day. But Frank, we're not going to talk about Bitcoin today. We're going to talk about Ethereum.
Bitcoin's
That is the topic du jour.
Old news.
Yeah.
Old news.
Ethereum is alive, my friend. We hit on this quite a bit on Monday, but let's jump right into it because we could potentially be one day away from an Ethereum spot ETF here in the United States. Not just one, there are a handful here. If we pull up the screen, this is off of Twitter from the Bloomberg terminal. A handful of ETFs
Gosh, a lot. Yeah.
that are waiting on a decision, but it could come tomorrow.
Crazy.
Are you excited, Frank? I thought you'd be more excited.
I don't care.
What? You don't care?
I don't care about the actual ETFs, but
Okay.
as a holder of Ethereum, I do care about what it means for the market itself, and I'm excited for. I want to know because here's the thing, Ryan. I know a little bit about crypto, maybe more than the average person. I'm long crypto. And this is one of those things that it was like, oh, the Bitcoin ETF, when the Bitcoin ETF goes off, oh my gosh, it's going to be crazy. And now there was a big fat rally in Bitcoin going into that ETF approval. The ETF approval came out and the market sold off a little bit and, bounced around. And now Bitcoin is still 70K, which is a lot better than what it was way before the ETF approvals.
Yeah, I think if you want to reference that on the chart, I think it was January 10th was when we got the approval.
Oh, gotcha.
So just in terms of when you're looking at, if people are looking at price performance. But to your point, it's up a ton
It's up a ton.
since then.
And so Ethereum is another one of those things where it's like, oh, okay, now they've got these Ether ETFs that are coming out. And obviously, you've seen the rally in ETH the last 24 hours, or 48 hours, actually. Huge rally.
Yeah, I think we're up 30% on the week right now.
30% week so far, and it's Wednesday. It's one of those things, Ryan, that the trader in me says like, and also the Sosnoff in me
Okay.
says like, who cares about this? Nothing has changed to the technology. Like it's one of those things where it's like, bank analyst says that Apple is a buy. And it's like, okay. And the market maybe moves up 1% or something like that. And it's like, well, nothing changed at Apple. So why the hell would the market be up 1%? I should be selling into this. And part of me does feel like, man, should I be selling my ETH here into this move because nothing has changed, but the market's up 30%. But now that being said, you have to walk that back a little bit because obviously something has changed because the market has moved 30% and it's not as liquid as the S&Ps or the US dollar market or the treasury market, but it's liquid enough that it can't be manipulated up 30% for some BS reason. And so I want you to tell me what the hell is going on. Why is it up 30%?
If we look at the chart here, you can see exactly what Frank's describing. I mean, we are waiting on what's next. Is this buy the rumor, sell the news, or do we see the continuation? I have to agree with you, dude. 30% move in 2 days. If I'm trading this, which constantly we are, whether you have a core position or not, I think you take some positions off and you just realize it. That to me is prudent. I had some long, like little micro futures that I got out of. I'm not selling my actual ETH, but trying to trade the move, yeah, I think like he just got 30% in a couple of days. That's a good trade, right? But when you think about, okay, what happens next? Why does this matter? The technology hasn't changed.
Yep.
You go back to Why do Bitcoin ETFs matter? Bitcoin's been around for a long time. It's pretty easy to buy. We offer it at Tasty Trade, by the way. Tasty Trade offers it, I should say.
Heard about that.
Yes. Why do the ETFs matter? You are connecting these massive pipes for capital flow. And in this space, you have assets like Bitcoin. There's a limited supply. It's still very early, as we like to say. And so you connect these massive pipes. You have institutional capital flow. You have new money that comes into the space. It supports the growth of the asset class. I think the sheer size of that potential capital flow definitely has an outsized impact. Presumably the price would go up, right? And so is that true? Well, we saw that happen to an extent. It supported the market. We saw that after the Bitcoin ETF approvals. So the view is, we might see something similar here. And there's some nuance to it. We'll get into the details, but that's why it matters. You have something that's got a $400 to $500 million market cap, and there's the potential for a lot more money to come into the space. Those ETFs remove the friction for institutional capital to an extent, institutional types of capital to participate. But it also, in some ways, it legitimizes it, right?
Yeah.
Like between you and me, in our eyes, it doesn't need to be validated or legitimized.
Sure.
But for a lot of investors here in 2024, it is, again, relatively new for most people. You need that ETF stamp of approval. And now every investment advisor has the ability to recommend it. There's going to be advertisements. They want to generate fees, et cetera, et cetera. That's why I think it matters.
And it's worth, I think, walking through that first part of it, just not at length, but the institutional part of it, Ryan, because I think a lot of people might say, well, dude, you could buy Ethereum today, you could buy it yesterday, you could buy it tomorrow without the ETFs. But the institutional part of it, there's so much red tape when it comes to, and what's a great example of someone who might now become essentially a price insensitive buyer of Ether?
Yeah, I would think about what we saw even, what was it, this week or last week, where we saw that headline we had talked about, the Wisconsin State Pension Fund, one of the pension funds for the state of Wisconsin, is allocating $100 million to BlackRock's IBIT Bitcoin ETF. It's those sorts of things, right? That's $100 million from one pension fund. It's certainly not the biggest pension fund.
And that, in the grand scheme of things, because you might, the naysayer out there might say, well, didn't you create this technology so that you wouldn't need stuff like ETF, these old traditional finance tools? And the answer is yes, at some point. Still, you always say this, we're relatively early. And in the grand scheme of things, this lets a Wisconsin pension fund, whatever, access Ethereum without having to completely upend everything, all their contracts and everything that probably don't say anything about, oh, the fund can open a crypto wallet and buy cryptocurrency in the spot market. Obviously, not having to do that and being able to access this in an ETF form on an institutional level allows for so much more capital and liquidity to come into the market. And then also, on the individual, it also does that on the individual level, because let's be frank here, like not everybody wants to open up this crypto wallet, especially if I've had my money at,
even think about your retirement account.
Yeah.
So sure,
Yeah.
you can go to Tasty Trade and you can trade crypto, or you can go to Coinbase or wherever you want to trade your crypto at. But you don't have the ability as an employee to allocate some money into a Bitcoin ETF, or you didn't up until this point. And so it opens up those flows as well, regardless of who you are.
And it's also, as a last point on the, like, why is this market rallying so much? Keep in mind that the ETF not getting approved was wholly priced into this market. And
I would like to think so. ETH was kind of dead, right?
well, it not only like was ETH dead
relative to Bitcoin.
relative to Bitcoin, we talked about it a little bit, and it's worth, if you're interested in stuff like this, Google it, because people explain it better than I do. The Grayscale ETH Trust was trading, Ryan, and I think they were saying more than a 20% discount to the actual, let's say there was $1 million invested in the trust, and they owned $1 million worth of Ether, the trust, the outstanding shares times the price, was trading at a 20% discount to the amount of Ether that they owned, because the idea was this trust is never going to turn into
This is not going to
an
happen anytime
ETF.
soon.
Exactly. In the same way we talk about all the time. I mean, we're at 5.5% interest rates, and everybody's waiting. When will the Fed cut? When will the Fed cut? When will the Fed cut? And the futures market prices that in, right? I mean, whether you're looking at Treasury yield futures or SOFR futures or Fed funds futures, those markets, it would be like we were going into an FOMC, Ryan, tomorrow with this ETF approval, and the odds of a rate cut were 20%. And then some news came out and it's like, actually, we're hearing that the odds should be more like 80%. You'd see a huge upheaval, and that market would move, all those interest rate markets would move huge. And that's what we've seen the last, so it was priced out of the market. They're pricing it almost into the market. And so you're seeing it from both ends, the fact that the odds have shifted and this market has been held down for so long. And now you potentially have these institutions, these individuals, so many people being able to access this market.
Yeah, if you asked people even just 2 weeks ago, to your point, no one thought this was a possibility.
Yeah.
So what's changed? Clearly something has changed in terms of maybe the U.S. policy, the perspective there. Nothing explicit aside from that. We know there's been some progress that's been made in Congress. And we've recently just seen, if you look at just ETFs alone, why is there a high probability all of a sudden of an approval? The SEC has asked these applicants to amend their filings, and they want to remove staking from it. So there's some interesting things that we could unpack there if you want. We can keep going on why I think the price probably over time is supported quite a bit by this. Who knows what the initial reaction is? 30% up on it. We'll see what happens. There will be profit taking, I would think, around 4,000 if you push higher.
No clue
There.
Yeah.
That's the local high. That's where we were, where we kind of topped out when we moved off of the Bitcoin ETF approval. So who knows? There's probably a little bit of room left to run, but I think people take some profits. But this could happen as early as tomorrow. No staking. So if you think about it very simply, as if there was a dividend involved with ETFs, these ETFs, this one can't pay a dividend. Mm-hmm. So as an investor, you could buy ETH, stake ETH, get the price appreciation and the yield. Here in the ETF, you are going to miss out on that yield. So it's less competitive versus doing this on your own.
Sure.
But much easier for institutions to access. Comes down to demand, though, Frank, and whether or not do institutions want this is the question.
I mean, what have we seen so far in the uptake around Bitcoin? And I know it's hard to decipher necessarily, but I don't know if there's a metric that you can look at.
We got 57 billion in assets under management. 34% is the Grayscale Bitcoin ETF, which was previously the trust. So it converts, and all of a sudden, it's the biggest ETF. But when you look at what started at zero, BlackRock is 33% of that. That's IBIT. So 57 billion, almost 60 billion. I think that rivals close to, it's got to be close to the GLD, Gold Shares ETF. And then you look at, what else is there that you can invest in today in a similar fashion when it comes to Ethereum. And there's about 11 billion in the Grayscale Ethereum ETF. There's a ProShares Ether ETF. It's got 88 million last I checked under management. You're seeing a lot of activity, obviously, in U.S. listed derivatives. I think options, or futures volume, maybe open interest. Something is at all-time highs. So that's what we have to go off of.
Okay.
You're going to convert on Grayscale, and then presumably BlackRock does a pretty good job. Fidelity does a pretty good job of marketing this. People have access to it. I don't know. I would think maybe you could get to easily half of where Bitcoin ETF volumes are, or assets under management. Excuse me.
So there you go.
What do you think?
No,
that's just me guessing.
I have absolutely zero clue, but this is the only thing that I think you could go off of is the uptake in Bitcoin. And
over time, I think people want this exposure.
Yeah.
It's seemingly.
Yeah, and I mean, the nice thing about it is you can look at all the fancy stats, but we'll just be watching the price act. Like the price action will tell you immediately how much perceived demand there is tomorrow if there is approval. And then the price action following will tell you how much demand there is ongoing, because we did see that run up in Bitcoin. And then it's a classic buy the rumor, sell the news. The day that the approval came through for Bitcoin, we did see a slight sell off. Now, that doesn't mean that that's what has to happen here. You know, we saw the 30% in ETH going into a potential, again, it's not approved, so we'll see what happens. But you could see that sell off, but everything is unique. I always caution people whenever you're like, oh, well, you know, this is what always happens on Google earnings.
Sure.
Then something different happens.
Yeah.
I mean,
we have
watch it.
no idea what we can go off of. And then I want to talk a little bit about the other side of that demand equation, which is supply, because when you get into crypto, there's some interesting kind of supply dynamics that we should point out that I'm not saying this is what's going to happen, but could increase the probability that you get kind of this squeeze or this, you know, kind of frantic price action, a lot of volatility, the upside that we see at times. But what we do have to go off of, Frank, on the slides here is the vol that the market's starting to price in. If this was in, you know, equity options, you've got almost like this earnings announcement, this kind of binary event. It seems to be a high probability of going one way. But when you look at where we are with ETH options, it's hanging on to the vol. Volatility jumped 12%. You can see that vol's come back down in Bitcoin, but volatility is 78%. I think we topped at like 85 or so, close to it. Gives you an expected move right now of about $400.
Okay.
So more than 10% of the underlying spot price, where the spot price is at 37.50. And then there's your range being priced, you know, slightly above on a one standard deviation basis for the next week, just a little bit above 4, and when still looking to not break through 3 on the downside. Anything could happen, but that's what the options markets are starting to price in after this move, hanging on to the vol.
Yeah, and again, I mean, if
I would be going long ETH and selling upside call options against it.
It's
be my trade here.
It's funny. I will agree with your idea that is at the backdrop of that trade strategy, which is like, of course, like I said earlier, I'm long. This seems like one of those things, Ryan, where I don't know if it's going to go up or down, but it seems like the 30% move, especially if the ETFs get approved, that was the big move. And now this is a classic case of like IV is playing catch up with realized vol, and we just saw a $400, $500 move. Do we see another one right afterwards if it's essentially confirming what was just priced in? If we went from, and the guys on, you can look at the tweet, we read it and talked about it on Monday. The analysts who are pretty close to this decision and have more insight into what the ETF providers are being asked, they said pretty simply that our odds went from 25% to 75% of this thing being pushed through. If you want to take it that simply, then you might say, okay, well, if that shift is worth $500, then maybe the full 100% is worth another, $200 or what have you. But it's hard to believe that this news came out, the big shift happens, you see the price action, and then they come out and approve this, and you see another huge move north of 4,100 or 4,200. I would agree with you. That's the only piece that I would kind of say feels like something we see a lot as options traders, which is like you got a big move, and then everyone spikes the IV afterwards. It's like, there's a natural disaster and everyone comes in with the higher insurance premiums. Yeah,
I tend to agree. I mean, here's how I think about it. To your point, you saw a good chunk of the move. The probability shifted quite a bit. We like big round numbers, so I wouldn't be surprised if we trade into 4,000. Maybe you poke above it for a second. But we also know that last time I checked, there was like 300 million in ETH that has moved to exchanges. That's not like a massive amount, but clearly investors are moving to exchanges to sell, right? You usually see that kind of precede selling, and then when it's moving off of exchanges, obviously people are moving to cold storage. They're not looking to pull the trigger. So there's that kind of backdrop to it. And look, I mean, this is an approval. This is a good thing, but it doesn't answer that question: is there demand for this?
Yeah.
We won't see those flows on day one. Yeah. We know how the Bitcoin ETF traded. I wouldn't be surprised to see something similar, but I think this is very bullish longer term. I want to talk very quickly about the supply dynamic here. And this is something that people should really kind of dig into. You have a scarcity element with Bitcoin, right? It's something where eventually there's only going to be 21 million, no more. With Ethereum, you don't exactly have the same thing, but you do have supply dynamics. There's fees that are associated with interacting with transacting in the network, interacting with the network, right? And so that base fee, Frank, that's paid is burned by the network. On the other side of that, you see an increase in supply that comes from rewards that go to validators that validate those transactions. But you have this interesting dynamic with ETH, at least right now, where it can be deflationary at times. Periods where you have the supply growth or the issuance in terms of rewards, but when you have more burning activity that's going on, more fees are being burned, the new tokens are being added to supply, it's deflationary.
Interesting.
We are right around there right now. There's a great site, if we could throw our browser up on the screen. This is called Ultrasound Money. And this will show you real-time metrics here around what Ethereum supply looks like, supply change. So if we look at this on a one-day basis, and then I'll kind of make my final point here. So you look at this in terms of what's the supply change over the last day? Well, it's 1,300 ETH. Good chunk of change, but if these ETFs lend themselves to anything close to the flows that we've seen in Bitcoin, that supply is going to look very, very illiquid. So that's where I think you could get the potential over time. Given this dynamic, you've also got to consider that like 30% of ETH is inherently illiquid in that it's staked or is being used. When you think about, we've been talking about liquidity pools on Uniswap. We've staked our ETH in a sense. We've locked it into a contract for providing liquidity. Now we can unstake. You can stop providing liquidity to validators, whatever it is. You can unstake, but not everybody's going to do that. And it's not like all of a sudden, there's ETFs, let's sell into it. Let's just not participate in any form that we were before on the network. So my point is it's pretty illiquid. And that's something to consider, that again, if you get those flows because you just hook those pipes up with ETH, well, here's a supply dynamic.
Quick thing on the first part of that before getting to the staking part. So you're saying if there is a lot of demand for the ETFs, there would be more ETH burned because...
No, not necessarily. Just that ETH is relatively illiquid and currently has a deflationary supply dynamic. And all of a sudden, a bunch of people want to buy that thing. It's an equivalent, I would think, reaction or kind of supply dynamic as what you see with Bitcoin. It's not driven by the same thing, but going into the ETF announcements and just over time, right? If you were to say how liquid is the existing supply of Bitcoin, it's not extremely liquid. How liquid is the current supply of Ethereum? Well, it can change, I suppose, but it's also really not that liquid. And so when you have those illiquid conditions in something where, as you know, everybody wants to buy it, you could see some outsized price moves. Not saying that that's what's going to happen. Nobody knows. But the conditions exist in the same way that they somewhat existed into the Bitcoin ETF approval.
And to be clear, these dynamics often work in both directions. Right? Like, because, absolutely, to your point, whether it's the fact that there's only X amount of supply at any given time, and that can grow or that could potentially plateau or it could fall, depending on how much interaction there is on the network on a given day. And in Bitcoin's case, it's different but similar, where the supply is growing but at a decreasing rate, eventually ending.
Yes, and that's why people look at the halving and talk about that as a bullish catalyst. Well, ultimately, regardless of how many people want to buy it, we're going to have less Bitcoin after each halving issued. The supply is going to grow more slowly.
It's like there's 100 oil rigs in the world, And after the halving, they can only pull half as much oil out of the ground after that, and then halving again and again and again until they can't work anymore. And while that does, of course, work to the upside of like, well, if we're coming out of the pandemic and everybody now wants to fly all over the place using jet fuel, wants to drive all over the place using gasoline, well, man, there's only so much crude oil. That price is going to skyrocket to what got to 125, whatever.
Yeah.
Also, though, to the downside, illiquid markets like this can get out of hand, and crude oil, I think, is an apt description going into that pandemic.
Yeah, you're going to have more volatility as a function.
You're going to have exactly right, and maybe I'm going on this long diatribe because the answer is you're going to have more volatility with a lesser liquid market like this, to both the upside and potentially the downside. Because to your piece on staking, if 30% of ETH is staked and we see a crash in ETH, and then everyone is unstaking and doing all these things to try to get their money out as quickly as possible, and there aren't so many buyers, that price is going to get annihilated. It works in both directions. Right now, what we've seen in the last 48 hours is obviously it working in the upside direction because there's only so much ETH.
Yes. And I will also point out, when you think about this, if you're new to Ethereum, Bitcoin, we've got the Bitcoin ETF. Clearly, it's the largest by market cap. But we're looking at, in terms of market cap perspective, we've got Bitcoin at 1.3 trillion right now, and ETH is at 450 billion. Maybe there's some catch up there. Who knows? There was a point in time where people thought the market cap of ETH would flip Bitcoin. Hasn't happened. But we're trading at about 500ths of a Bitcoin when we look at the current price of ETH. So we talked about that spread. So there's a little bit of context around the size there. And then, you look at Solana versus ETH, it's like 80 billion versus ETH. So a very small asset class in the grand scheme of things, but Bitcoin dwarfs everything else right now. Who knows? We could see, again, a little bit of catch up over time if you get these Ethereum ETF approvals. Could happen as early as tomorrow. And
that's the next piece in this world where we're getting ever ahead of ourselves, I guess. This is in our lifetimes, we've created the Amazon model, right? Which is like, you don't have to make money for your stock price to skyrocket. Obviously, that worked out for the shareholders in that situation. We'll see if it works out in this situation where it's like, you got the numbers right in front of you, where it's like, man, I don't see that much engagement necessarily on the Ethereum network, but the scarcity and a couple of other things stack up to the price action that we've been seeing. Crypto essentially a rounding error off of all-time highs. We'll see if it fulfills that prophecy. But the next thing will be, and I've seen the price action, some of the layer twos and some of the smaller, you talked about Solana, but there's even smaller ones. Do those markets enter the equation at some point? And is that the piece that I should be getting into? Should I be selling my ETH? Should I be getting into a Solana or a smaller market cap that'll become the next ETH, which is not even yet become the next Bitcoin? I don't know, man. You tell me.
Let's leave it at that. We'll try to answer that question on Monday's show because we're out of time today. But thank you, everyone, for watching. That's going to do it for our show. We'll be back on Monday. Hopefully, you'll be here with me, Frank.
Hopefully, we'll have an Ethereum ETF.
That would be nice. Till then, I'm Ryan.
I'm Frank.
Peace.